Hey, what's going on? Jamie here. It's been quite a while since I've done any sort of an instructional video, so decided to make one on my favorite subject, landscape photography. We're going to cover focus stacking, exposure bracketing, and a lot more. So I'll stop talking now and let's get to it. Hey, what's going on, you guys? It's kind of a cold, rainy day here in Michigan, and decided to go back through and run a little video on the processing of an image that recently hit Explore on Flickr. It's one of my favorite images I've taken probably in the last few weeks, and it was always, it's a pleasant surprise always to have something hit Explore on Flickr and get so much positive feedback from an image. And I figured maybe this would be a good example of just showing my post-processing workflow and a little bit of behind the scenes on how I'm shooting some of these images. So I went out to this old truck that's not too far from my home. As we were approaching sunset, we had a break in the cloud cover, and I was hoping for some dynamic light to occur. And you'll never know if you don't venture out, and take the chance on seeing something happen. And for a minute there, I didn't think it was going to happen, but luckily I did take the trip out and did happen to catch, again, what happened to be one of my favorite images taken over the last several weeks. So I've already taken the liberty of going through my Lightroom library and giving these a star rating just so that you can see them separate from the rest of the images that were shot there that night. You can see by the labeling on the images in the library view here, these were shot with the Sony a7 III. I'm using the Tamron 17 to 28 mm f2.8 lens. And you'll notice right away that these are bracketed images. So these are bracketed shots at plus or minus 3 EV each. So this allows me to get the most amount of dynamic range out of the image as possible. Granted, a single frame from the Sony a7 III is loaded with tons of dynamic range, and maybe my methodologies for bracketing shots are sort of a holdover from shooting with crop sensor cameras. Not quite sure, but I'm always happy with the results that I get shooting this way. Now, you'll also notice that in addition to having, 3 frames for this image, I've got another 3 bracketed shots and yet another 3 bracketed shots. And the reason for that is that I've kind of gotten into this mode where I'm starting to shoot more and more focus stacked images. Now, the benefits to shooting focus stacked images should be pretty obvious, but for those who aren't aware of the technique or why people use it, I'll just go over that briefly. So, focus stacked image, such as the case here, allows me to have my foreground in focus, which is the truck, and I want my background in focus as well. I want the clouds to be nice and sharp and crisp. You can sort of see here that we've got some crepuscular rays or God rays, whatever you like to call them, are shining up through the clouds. I want those to be nice and sharp and defined as well. So what I've done here is I've gone through and I've taken each one of these shots, each one of these series of shots at a different focal point. So the first series of images, I'm focusing on the truck. Midpoint on the truck, I'm shooting at f11, so it gives me a pretty decent depth of field on the camera. And again, shooting at a really wide angle of 17 millimeters, you already are given, a decent amount of depth that way right out of the gate. So again, focused about midpoint on the truck, somewhere around in here on the truck. And then the next series of shots, again, is going to be shot on a different focal point. So on the next image here, I'm focused somewhere out here in the foreground. Just trying to go off of memory again, this was several weeks back. I'm pretty sure I focused right here at the beginning of the tree line. And then finally, on the last series of shots, I am focused more towards where up into the sky here on the clouds. So by focusing in 3 different points in the image and then blending them all together in post, what you'll end up getting is an image with a ton of depth to it, and everything in focus from front of camera all the way to infinity. So let's just jump into this and get started on how I would handle processing an image shot like this. It's pretty straightforward for the most part. The initial part is very, very simple. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to take the first 3 images from this sequence, and I do all of my HDR editing in Lightroom. There are aftermarket additional programs that allow you to do HDR processing. Photomatics is one that comes to mind. Luminar, or not Luminar, but Skylum has a software as well. But I'm just going to do this in Lightroom right now, just for ease of workflow. So it's as simple as Photo, Merge, HDR. I selected my first 3 images in this sequence. You'll get this dialog that's going to pop open. It's going to create a preview for us. And this is what merging those 3 frames looks like. You'll notice that a standard exposure wouldn't have the foreground evenly exposed like that with as much shadow detail as we have here, nor would you have as much detail in the sky either, because you'd probably end up with blown out highlights. You wouldn't be able to see any sort of detail in the tree line back there or anything. The settings that I've got here in HDR, I've got auto align on. So what that's going to do is if there was any camera shake in between frames, which I should mention I was on a tripod for this shot, so very little movement in between each of the 3 frames. But if there were, the algorithms within Lightroom will help align the image so that there's no ghosting caused by slight movements between frames. And I've just got it set on auto settings. I've never taken it off auto settings, to be honest with you, so I can't even begin to tell you what taking it off of that does. My guess is it's going to give you a little more granular control over how highlights and shadows and things like that are handled. And then the next section here is the deghosting. So deghosting comes in handy if there were any sort of a breeze going on and you have some sway in the trees or things like that. It's going to do its best to help eliminate that during the alignment process. So I've got it on none. It was a very calm night. There's not really any movement going on in the weeds here in the foreground or in the trees or anything. So with that said, I'll just hit merge, and I'm going to let this merge. And I'm actually, while that's merging, let me go back to my library here. Unfortunately, working with the ratings turned on, I think once it created that, well, okay, I guess it didn't. I was afraid that when it created the DNG, because it wasn't a star rated image, that it maybe threw me back into the main gallery view, but it didn't. So let's jump back in and we'll merge these as well. So photo, merge, HDR. There is a shortcut for this. It's Option H. And honestly, my DPI setting on my mouse is pretty quick, so I can move rather fast through my screen here and not do the shortcuts constantly. And I'm selecting those last 3. Apologies for this jumping back into the main library view that's not filtered. I'm not sure why it's doing that, but let's just merge this final one here. I'm going to turn my filters back on and see if it just gets me back to the ones we were originally working with. Good, and it has. So all of these are merged now, and you'll see the first 3 images that were done in the first bracketed sequence, and Lightroom creates a DNG file, which is Adobe's version of a raw file. DNG, I'm going to guess, is Adobe Negative. So there's one DNG file, another DNG file, and finally a third one. So again, those were all DNG files created from bracketed images that are all on separate focal planes or focal depths in this image. So now we have 3 quote-unquote HDR images, all at different focal depths. Now we need to merge them all together so that we reap the benefits of having shot this way. So we'll have everything in focus from front to back. And that, again, is pretty simple. We'll just go through and we'll highlight the 3 DNG files. And we're going to edit in. And we're going to open them as layers in Photoshop. So we do that. Photoshop will launch. I've already got it running in the background, so hopefully it just automatically jumps over to that screen, which is it gonna do it for me? All right, then I'll just go over and get into Photoshop. And it might take a minute depending on your computer setup. I've got a relatively new iMac loaded out with RAM, so shouldn't take too long. Oh, I'm getting little pop-ups from Photoshop. It must have updated recently. So again, it could be, you know, a little bit lengthier of a process for it to load the images in and go through the steps that we're about to do. They can take a little time, but don't fret. So here we are. We've got all 3 images opened up into Photoshop, and they're all on individual layers because that's what we chose to do when we did the export from Lightroom, opened as layers. So we will just select all of the layers, go to Edit, and Auto Align Layers. And from here, I leave it on Auto, and just let Photoshop rather figure out the best projection method for stacking these 3 images together. And again, this align is going to work very similarly to what it was doing when you were doing the HDR merge in Lightroom. It's going to grab really contrasty edges, and if there was any shift from one sequence to the next, it's going to align based off of things like, oh, the roof line of the truck here or the tire. It's going to snap to these sharp edges and align each of the 3 layers together. We've got a section here for lens corrections. It can do a really good job of removing vignette. If you end up having vignette for some reason, when you blend these together, I generally don't tick either of these 2 boxes. I have ticked the geometric distortion box one time and ended up with a crazy looking image, and it was probably just a fluke or something that I had done wrong on my end in the initial image capture. But ever since then, I've never checked the box, and I really don't feel the need to. So we'll just click OK. Excuse me. Okay, so here we have, it went through that process relatively quickly. It's pretty easy for Lightroom, or for Photoshop rather, to process this. But you'll see over here on the left-hand side of the image, we've got a little bit of a gap here. Let me zoom in. And you can see this is where there was probably movement between one frame to the next while I was on my tripod. So we'll be able to fix that pretty easily in this next step. Now we still have our 3 layers combined, or rather selected over here on the right in our layers panel, and they've all been aligned. So they're all lined up good. We go back to Edit and Auto Blend Layers. And here we want to stack the images, and I do tick these 2 boxes: seamless tones and colors, and content aware fill transparent areas. Having a lot of trouble talking today. So what these 2 do, okay, so let's look at it this way. So stacked images, we'll start with that first. So stacked images is going to allow us to have that great depth of field from front to back of image. It's going to stack all of the images on top of one another, and you're going to get this seamless transition from each image, from one image to the next, bringing through each of the 3 focal planes that we shot for this. The seamless tones and colors is pretty much what it says, because we're blending multiple different layers together. We want the colors and the tones between the colors to be natural looking. We don't want any sort of anomalies from that stacking process. And then the content aware fill transparent areas, that's going to handle this spot over here on the left hand side of the image. So we'll just go ahead and click OK, and we'll let this run. This does take a little bit longer generally than the aligning of the layers. There's a lot more AI at work in the background here, I suppose, trying to figure out what to fill in the blank space back there and what it needs to do to make sure that your colors and your tones all have a seamless and smooth finish to them. So we're done. And if you look to the left of the image over here, you can see the selection right here, the marching ant selection. You can see that it did a good job of filling in whatever would have been probably appropriate to put in that empty space over on the frame there. So I go ahead and hit Command D to deselect that. and you can see what we've got here. Oop, didn't want to do that. There we go. So again, nice clean job filling in the edges over there. And you can see over here on the right, you've got the 3 layer masks that were created by Photoshop automatically, and you can see the different focal planes on those. I'm not going to try and blow that up or anything for you to see it, but take my word for it. We are now sharp from front of image all the way through to infinity. So once we're done here, I select all the layers and I just merge these layers into one. And then I exit out and I save it. And that sends us back over into Lightroom, and from there we'll have a PSD file or Photoshop file in Lightroom that we can work with, and there it is right there. So now that we're back into Lightroom, this is where I would probably get into work doing a little more editing, and I'll just kind of go over sort of quickly what my process is for editing a scene like this. So right out of the gate, I tend to start from the top of my panels and work my way down. So we're going to start off in the basic panel here, and I love to work with texture. Overall, I want to boost the texture up across the whole image. There's a lot of detail on the truck here, the grass and weeds in the foreground have all sorts of texture, as well as the clouds. So this is something that I feel comfortable doing a global adjustment on, and not using something like a gradient filter, graduated filter, or brushing it in or something of that nature. I do want to bring the highlights down just a little bit because we are over towards the sunset hour, and I do want to warm up the scene. And right now I'm not sure if I want to warm it up globally or if I want to warm it up using a graduated filter. So what I will do is slowly bump the temperature up just to see how I feel about the overall scene being warmed up, and I'm comfortable with how that looks. The exposure can come back down a little bit though. Be a little bit more representative of what it was like out there. The strong glow that I was getting on the bottom of the clouds. The highlights are still pretty hot right there, so I think we can bring those down even further. Maybe not that far. I like that. Much better. All right, so again, we've already enhanced the texture. The clarity slider is one that can get out of control really quickly, but I do find that since I'm sharing on Facebook a lot of my images, if I do bump the clarity up just a little bit to like 10 or 15, it doesn't end up being too much of a problem for those shares. I love the Dehaze filter. I love how it works in creating a lot of definition between things like low-hanging clouds and blue sky above. The problem with running Dehaze, though, is that it tends to cool the image off. We did go through and warm everything up. So if I do slide this Dehaze slider, you will see that it tends to cool the image down quite a bit. So I try to not be too heavy-handed with Dehaze, just enough to bring myself definition to the clouds. It helps bring out the structure of the clouds quite a bit. And I am a sucker for saturation, so bumping the saturation up a bit. So the next thing I'm going to start working on is I'm not going to do anything with lens corrections. We do have a little bit of distortion shooting again at 17 millimeters. It's rather wide, but I'm going to leave that the way it is. And everything is nice and level for the most part. I'm not going to change anything in the transform panel either. So really on this one, it's going to be pretty simple. I'm just going to jump over into the Hue Saturation and Luminance sliders. These are, to me, where a lot of the magic happens in working with an image. So we're going to start off on the saturation panel first, and I'm going to start working on the sky. I always work from the top of the image down for some reason. So I want my blues to be saturated. We have a little bit of purple and magenta in here in the clouds, as well as lots of orange and yellow. So the saturation on those will be bumped up. And again, I do in small increments. It's really easy for things to get really out of hand really quickly. And I find that I like to tell people the devil's in the details. So even minor adjustments in the details of the scene, I think, tend to make a big impact. So you don't have to go really far with things. Now the luminance, basically think of this as like exposure or radiance in those particular colors that you're working with. I like to have my skies nice and dark. Again, it was towards sunset, a little ominous, a little dark, a little moody. And I think I am going to darken the yellows just a little bit. And again, this is all to taste. So what I'm doing isn't gospel. It's not like I'm saying this is the only way to do it. But this should give you a decent idea of where to start with an image. So I think I'm set and pretty happy with what I've got so far, just working from the panels. And at the end of everything within Lightroom anyways, then that's when I'll start going through and I'll start working with adjustment brushes and graduated filters and things like that. I do want to run a graduated filter though down here in the foreground. The foreground it's probably fine, but I want it to be a little more unrealistic. I want a little bit more exposure there, so I'm going to start off with an exposure graduated filter here, and it's already at like 0.4, like half a stop or something like that. Probably doesn't need to be quite as high as that, but I do want the shadows bumped up a little bit. So let's just drag this up. So you can see right here how much range the graduated filter has on it right now. It's at its densest, obviously, at the bottom of the image, and it's graduated, so it fades out as we work up in the image. And this is the region, basically, from tree line down that I wanted to work on the most. So I'll start bumping up the shadows just a little bit. Those are mostly going to bring up shadows here in the tree line and in the truck. There aren't a lot of shadows down here in the foreground, in the weeds, to necessarily bring up, but you can see there, I think that I like that. We've got a lot of light here in the foreground, actually maybe a little too much. Let me bring that back just a little bit there. And again, me and the texture slider, it's funny, it's not something that I used a whole lot in the past, but watching my girlfriend wield the texture slider made me realize just how much crispiness you can add to your image with it. Okay, so here we are with the what I would say finished in Lightroom product. And once I've gotten all of my, I'll call this color grading, once I've gotten all the color grading done in Lightroom, I'm going to send it back out into Photoshop one more time to remove some things that, again, for depending on your tastes, might not be something you would necessarily do, but for me it is something that I feel like I have to do. I'm kind of neurotic about this. So I want, in my head, I want this truck to be out in the middle of nowhere, and it's not. You can see over on the right hand side of the frame, it's off the road probably a couple hundred feet, but it's kind of in a semi-residential area. So I want to remove some of the bigger distractions in the scene. So I use a handful of different tools. I'll start off with the patch tool or content aware fill or clone. It just depends on the thing that I'm removing and how much control I need to have over what goes in the spot that I removed something from. Oftentimes for small details like this, I think this is like a little road sign or mailbox potentially, patch tool often works plenty good. And again, these are just small details that are way off in the background that, again, for some people might not even be a bother, but for me, I'm just super picky about these. I know that the majority of people that look at my images just see them on Facebook or Instagram or something like that. It's very rare that I have someone over at my home looking at an image printed out, or I don't really sell prints hardly ever, so that's not very often either. And I don't want spot healing. Here's another fun one, is the healing brush tool. Oh, I grabbed the wrong brush again. Jeez, I did want the spot healing. So with spot healing, I want to get rid of this. It's like a protective sleeve over a telephone pole. cable. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click here at the top of it and then come down in a straight line to the bottom and hold shift and click again, and it completed the line between the first click and the second click. And that's just a quick way to get rid of some of those things. Now I do have this bigger roadwork sign here. That one might be a little bit more trickier to deal with. So I'm going to first start off with the patch tool and see what the patch tool does. It's probably not going to work. Actually, let's content aware fill this thing. How about that? Actually, that worked pretty good. It did copy the top of this fence post here with a rock on it. You can see it just kind of floating in their yard. And this is probably where, again, I would just grab the patch tool and I will just copy part of the yard like that. And I will get rid of this little white object. Again, it was something that it copied over during the content aware fill section. Zoom back out. I think I'm going to go in and make this house disappear. I know a lot of this is really overkill, but it's just so white and distracting in the background. And now that I look at it, I think I'm probably going to take the road out. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm doing all this for this picture. But being a little neurotic about your images probably isn't horrible, right? And I know at some point when if you change enough of the image, oops, click a little too quick there. If you change enough of the image, at what point are you no longer left with the original image at all? But I've told people since I first got into photography, to me, photography is art, and I look at this almost like painting in that when I take an image, when I shoot an image, I consider that basically the canvas onto which I will paint my emotions or my imagination, whatever it may be, to help create the image that I want it to be. Let's get out here and sample from a different area. Well, the road is slowly disappearing. Maybe one more. It's just the hard straight lines of man-made objects, I think, that kind of drive me nuts. I am really not going to go through the process of trying to remove this gate. If anything, I might just crop in on the final image just to remove, a bit of this house. But for the parts of the house that I can't remove, maybe I just do something like this. And what the heck, let's use the clone stamp tool to get rid of the road. What do you think of that? All right, let's get rid of the rest of the house. I can't just leave it there. And if you jumped over onto Flickr and really started to pick apart this image, it'd be pretty easy to see, to a degree, how much manipulation has been done to the image. I mean, I'm not shooting with a A7R series camera, so I don't really have the pixel density and pixel information to be picking apart the image at this level. I mean, you can see looking up close, it's pretty janky, to say the least. But it gives you an idea of kind of how I tackle some of the things when I'm out shooting. I spent years never allowing power lines to be in my images at all, and just recently started to accept that power lines exist in the wild, and I should embrace their rigid beauty and allow them to live in my images. But you know, not all the time. Just sometimes I don't want any hint of people, humans, anything non-natural. And you're probably thinking, what is he talking about? He's got like an old 1940s truck in his image. Well, yes, I do. There's a method to my madness, but at the end of the day, it is madness, right? And keep in mind also, I am really rushing through this just for the sake of the video. I mean, if I wanted to be really, really, really particular about it, I would be going much slower during this whole process. So there we have it. I think I'm pretty happy with how this image turned out. So I'll just quit and I'll save it. And we'll jump ourselves back over into Lightroom here. Ooh, I don't know if you heard that, but my dog snores. A little Shih Tzu. She's loud when she snores. So there you have it, folks. I think that this is probably a finished product. You know, it took me, 10 minutes maybe to run through this process. And, you know, it's one of those things where the more you do it, the faster you get. The more you do it, the more you realize when you're out shooting scenes that are going to benefit from a technique like this. So practice with it in different conditions, you know, whether it's sunrise and sunset or whether it's the middle of the day, whether you're in the woods on a sunny day or a cloudy day. There will be a lot of different times where you find that a particular post-processing technique will work, and the more you use those techniques, the more you're going to start seeing out in the field, you know, what your technique is going to be when you get home. So you kind of start to pre-visualize what you're going to end up with. When I was out there shooting this truck, I knew exactly what I was going to do. You know, again, I said I'd been doing focus stacked images for a while, so I knew I'm going to focus stack. And I knew that because of the dynamic lighting that was going on, there was so much in the shadows and in the highlights that I knew I would be benefiting from bracketing my image. And I do shoot with filters a fair amount. I've got a bunch of Nisi and H&Y filters. And the best filter for a scene like this would have been probably a reverse graduated or a medium grad. But the problem you run into is that with the reverse graduated, it's designed to tone down that bright spot on the horizon out here, you know, where we've got the sun just getting just below the tree line here as it's setting. Because it's going to be darker on the horizon with the filter, you're going to end up with a black line through everything. So if I'm shooting a landscape where I don't have a prominent foreground subject, then I will, you know, for the most part, avoid using a filter and just bracket my shots. So I know I'd probably end up getting a question about why I wasn't using filters for a scene like this, and that's why. That, and to be honest with you, I love just jumping in and doing some post-processing. So there you go, folks. That's just a quick run through of how I've edited one of my most recent favorite photos. You know, again, one that got a lot of attention and love over on Flickr. And if you want to go check out that version over there, maybe compare it to this one, I'll leave my link to my Flickr account in the description below. Thanks for watching, you guys. And if you've got any questions, comments, suggestions about videos you'd like to see coming up, just let me know. And until the next video, you guys take care, get out there and shoot, and don't forget to share what you're shooting. I'd love to see it. Take care.